Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to be with you for session number 5. And here, while the Pope was in the news, it's a good place to start. At the end of our last session, one attendee mentioned the letter that Pope Francis recently penned to the US bishops. So on February 11th, Pope Francis acknowledged the delicate moment that the US bishops face as pastors. And Pope Francis spoke forcefully against the program of mass deportations. He reminded the bishops of the Church's clear and unequivocal teachings on the care of migrants and the dignity of every human person. And in penning a letter to the US bishops, Pope Francis is really speaking to all of us. He exhorted the faithful, quote, not to give in to narratives that discriminate against and cause unnecessary suffering to our migrant and refugee brothers and sisters. And the quote that you have on the screen also sort of reinforces this, that it sort of warns us against sort of the walls that divide us and causing unnecessary suffering. Instead, we should live in solidarity and fraternity and build bridges. Those are very much sort of watchwords for Pope Francis. The timing of the letter was hardly coincidental. It was seen as a direct rebuke against the current presidential administration, including Vice President Vance's attempt to use Catholic theology to justify a crackdown on immigration. Vance, a convert to Catholicism, had tried to use St. Thomas Aquinas's concept of ordo amoris, or the order of love, to suggest that we can prioritize levels of care and concern. Pope Francis rejected that, saying, quote, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests, but rather a fraternity open to all without exception. Pundits were quick to call the Pope's letter unprecedented. It's indeed rare for a Pope to insert himself directly into American politics and comment on particular policy decisions. But this is certainly not the first time that a Pope has issued a rebuke of American values and the views espoused by certain American Catholics. A few observers immediately recognized historical parallels between this episode and an earlier papal rebuke, Pope Leo XIII's condemnation of Americanism in 1899. The point of comparison was made by theologian Massimo Fagioli of Villanova University, and then explored further by Michael Sean Winters, a columnist writing in the National Catholic Reporter. While historians may have gotten the reference, it requires a bit of explanation. In 1899, Pope Leo issued a letter, Testem Benevolentiae, translated as Witness to Goodwill, that raised concerns about certain tendencies and beliefs among American Catholics. The letter criticized efforts to introduce novelties and modifications into Catholic belief and practice. That included Americans' embrace of liberty and the separation of church and state. Those sorts of modifications ran counter to the Church's own understanding of the proper political order, which emphasized the union of church and state. The idea here was that the Catholic Church, as the one true church, deserved special recognition and privileges. The church blessed the state, and the state supported the church. Leo condemned the idea that there could be, quote, a church in America different from that which is in the rest of the world. Pope Leo XIII sort of lumped all of these modern modifications under the heading of Americanism. In many ways, it was a catch-all condemnation of anything that was new and innovative. It was a reflection of a certain strain of Catholic anti-modernism. Scholars have long noted that Pope Leo was chasing a, quote, phantom heresy. But still, his letter was a word of warning to American church leaders, reminding them that the Catholic Church should not become too accustomed to its particular American situation when it came to the political order. Pope Francis's recent letter may not have been entirely unprecedented, but the tables have turned. The 1899 letter was a rebuke of a certain American Catholic liberalism. Pope Francis's recent interjection was a rebuke of a certain strain of American Catholic conservatism. So for tonight's session, I'd like to look a little bit more deeply at the history of these Americanist debates and the question of what it means to be American and Catholic, and whether those two sets of values are compatible or in tension. And in thinking about some of these sort of more recent debates, I thought that it might be useful in this final session to spend some time looking at the history of some of the recent polarization in the American Catholic Church itself. I think that it's important for us to have a bit of history there so that we can understand some of the divides and divisions that we now face as a Catholic community that maybe can help us think about ways of overcoming that and looking for solutions to our current divisions. And then hopefully, if time allows, we'll have a few moments for an extended Q&A at the end of the session, especially for those who may have been tuning in for the whole series, may have questions about this or other episodes. But even if you're joining us for the first time, it's a chance to have a wider conversation about the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. The sense of American distinctiveness is nothing new. It can be traced back to the earliest days of the Church in the United States. Scholars of American Catholicism have pointed to the influence and precedents set by John Carroll, the first bishop in the United States. He was appointed the head of the Diocese of Baltimore in 1789. At that time, his diocese covered the whole United States, from Maine to Georgia, from the East Coast to the Mississippi. And it was certainly not an easy job. Carroll had to ensure that the new US government respected the rights of the Catholic minority. He wrote to President Washington, reminding Washington of the fact that Catholics fought in the Revolution and have claims to the equal rights of citizenship. Carroll also had to prove his case to Rome, which was extremely wary about American religious tolerance and pluralism. In 1783, Carroll wrote to Vatican officials to argue that the free toleration of religion was, quote, a blessing and advantage, which is our duty to preserve and improve with the utmost prudence. In other words, Carroll was warning that the separation of church and state should not be something that Catholics in the United States should attempt to eliminate. It would lead to severe blowback. Carroll accepted the democratic spirit of the United States, as well as the separation of church and state as fundamental political principles. And here, Carroll was very much accustomed to this American arrangement because Carroll himself had been born in the colonies. He was a Marylander, he was familiar with American political culture, and he was also mindful of what it meant for Catholics to be in a minority. During his episcopate, Carroll took the lead in laying out a plan for the early US Church. Among the things that he advocated were, not surprisingly, religious toleration and the separation of church and state. He had been schooled in Enlightenment values. He understood the importance of reason and persuasion. He also advocated for the creation of a seminary so that he could train priests familiar with American customs. He called for the use of vernacular in worship. He called for the election of bishops by the clergy. And he also favored the limited lay authority within the parish. In some ways, some who look back in his career sort of almost see him as a precursor of Vatican II, but more accurately, I would simply say that he was mindful of the particular political context in which the Catholic Church in the United States operated. In short, he believed that Catholics could accept American values. And this leads to what scholars have called the Maryland tradition within American Catholicism, going all the way back to Bishop Carroll, sort of emphasizing the fundamental compatibility of American and Catholic values. And kind of this whole strain, this Maryland tradition, has a sort of a prominent place in American Catholic historical literature. Sort of successive generations of scholars of American Catholicism liked to emphasize this particular strain of Catholic thought and this emphasis on compatibility. You have kind of very prominently in the mid-20th century when Catholics were struggling for political acceptance that we see in something like John F. Kennedy's presidential administration, where to be Catholic was to be suspect. The idea was that Catholics could not be fully American. So scholars went back and looked to somebody like Carroll to say, no, since the earliest days of the church in the United States, we see efforts to make a point that Catholics could indeed be good American citizens and children of the Republic. So Carroll is sometimes described as laying the foundation for a Republican Catholicism. And here, Republican simply means the early Republic, the early years of the United States, not today's Democratic-Republican divide. Historian Thomas Spalding emphasized that, Carroll, in the words of historian Thomas Spalding, believed that American Republican principles offered the greatest hope of survival and progress to the universal church in the future. And Carroll's policies were opposed by some of the sort of European clergy who came to the United States, including those who were refugees from the French Revolution, who were much more sort of suspect about liberty and freedom than somebody like Carroll, who had lived through the American Revolution as opposed to the French Revolution. One other thing about Carroll was that he believed that matters particular to the local church should be left to local determination. And this idea was put into practice in a series of synods and councils convened by the US bishops during the 19th century. In 1791, Carroll held a diocesan synod, a gathering of priests of his diocese, to address questions of particular importance to them, like whether converts to Catholicism needed to be rebaptized, and the answer was no. Of the plenary councils that took place throughout the 1800s, perhaps the most notable was the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1884. It's probably the most famous because it was here that the US bishops decreed that every parish with the financial means to do so should establish its own parochial school. That was not a Vatican directive, but rather an American policy, issued in response to debates over sectarian schooling that were unique to the church in the United States. The Third Plenary Council also authorized a catechism, which came to be known as the Baltimore Catechism, which remains a foundation for religious instruction still to this day. And in some ways, these synods and plenary councils were simply a matter of practicality. Distance meant that the US church had to govern its own affairs. This was also before the codification of canon law, which did not take place until 1918. So these synods and councils served as a kind of a deliberative body. And one could ask, well, couldn't bishops in other countries do the same? Yes. But unlike in Europe, the US church was free from external interference on the part of the government. In Europe, the church in France or the church in Spain had to deal with sort of royal control or the influence of kings and emperors. So here the United States had something distinctive. The separation of church and state allowed the US church to function freely in a way that didn't happen in other places, especially in Europe at the time. These debates over whether or not Catholics could be American and Catholic continued, as did the question over whether or not the Vatican could accept these American political values. During the 19th century, the late 19th century, we saw kind of this Americanist crisis emerge again that led up to Pope Leo XIII's letter Testem Benevolentiae. At this time, there was sort of a split among the US bishops. They divided between sort of a liberal Americanist camp and a more conservative Roman camp. The issue boiled down to whether the Catholic Church could be adapted to American conditions, like the separation of church and state. The Americanists said yes, the Romanists said no. And we have here kind of a quote from Pope Leo XIII, 1895, a few years before Testem Benevolentiae, where he sort of commented how the church would bring forth more abundant fruits if, in addition to liberty, she enjoyed the favor of the laws and the patronage of the public authority. In other words, state support, state sanction, state privileges. One thing that I find really interesting is that as much as the Vatican condemned this particular American situation, we also find lots of examples where European Catholics became themselves converted to this American-style separation of church and state and came to see its distinct benefits. Some of its most vocal critics became its defenders. And there have been some interesting studies done on the Jesuits in the United States that during the 1850s, the 1860s, the church in the United States became home to a number of refugee Jesuits, those who were expelled from European countries for one reason or another, including sort of Jesuits from Italy, who sort of were expelled by the unifications of Italy, the sort of the nationalist revolutions. As those sort of political turmoils roiled through Italy, they fled. They came to the United States. They came to places like California and established Santa Clara University. They worked throughout the American Southwest. And here they discovered that the lack of state support was actually to their benefit because it meant that they no longer had to worry about state scrutiny. The same state powers and royal powers in Europe that could bless the church could also punish the church. And so here that they would be entirely free. The same thing happened a little bit later with refugee clergy from Mexico in the 1910s and 1920s. As the Mexican Civil War erupted, the American Southwest, from Texas to New Mexico, absorbed sort of many sort of refugee clergy who previously enjoyed state support in Mexico and now came to the United States, initially suspect of this arrangement, but found that they were more free to act. And that was an argument that was made by Father Isaac Hecker, who may be a figure that some of you recognize. He's a New Yorker, he's a convert to Catholicism, and he himself establishes a new religious order known as the Paulists. And it was his goal to evangelize the United States, the way that Paul the Apostle evangelized the Gentiles, bringing Catholicism from sort of bringing Christianity from kind of the initial apostles in the Jewish community out to the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world. Now Isaac Hecker was going to bring sort of the Catholic message, the Christian message from Europe to an American Gentile audience. And it was Isaac Hecker who helped to articulate some of this vision for the benefits of separation of church and state. In one letter in 1887, he spoke about the providential nature of the American political situation. And then curiously, it was a biography of Isaac Hecker that was translated into French that was one of the things that influenced Pope Leo XIII's condemnation of Americanism. Leo XIII did not visit the United States. He was not reading kind of American political thought, but he read that letter by Isaac Hecker that talked about how it was God's providence leading to the separation of church and state that started to raise some of those questions and suspicions of these American values. Jumping ahead a little bit, the Americanist strain and the Maryland tradition seem to have faded by the early 20th century in light of those condemnations. But it resurfaced at the time of the Second Vatican Council. And we can see this most clearly in the work of John Courtney Murray, who was a leading Catholic theologian of his generation. Born in 1904 in New York, he entered the Jesuits at age 16. After his ordination in 1933, he studied in Rome and then returned to teach at the Jesuit seminary in Woodstock, Maryland. So he's part of this Maryland tradition. In 1960, he published We Hold These Truths, Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition, It was a collection of essays on the topic of religious liberty and the separation of church and state, topics that had dominated Murray's own intellectual career. Although at one point he was told to stop writing on the topic of religious freedom, his work helped influence Vatican II's statement on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, issued in 1965 at the end of the council. So how did Murray manage to reverse long-standing church teachings that upheld the unity of church and state as the ideal? He argued that religious liberty flowed from human dignity. To force a person to believe, or to force a person to reject belief, as socialist states like the Soviet Union had done, was to Murray a violation of our fundamental human dignity. For Murray, every person is bound to follow his or her conscience. And that means it allows for religious liberty. Our conscience may lead us to the truth. It can also lead us in error, but we cannot go against our own conscience. To compel belief was coercion, even if it was in service to the one true church. So here, he sort of switched the topic of conversation. Rather than focusing on church-state unity, he talked about human dignity and the primacy of human conscience. And so it was through human dignity that it opened the door to religious pluralism. The document was one of the most highly contested and debated of the council. But this was also kind of an important piece of a conversation about ecumenism. For the Vatican II's embrace of ecumenism and interreligious dialogue would have been pointless without the Declaration of Religious Liberty, because you needed to respect the fundamental belief of those who were your ecumenical dialogue partners. And so it was through kind of John Courtney Murray and the Second Vatican Council that some of those older debates over the separation of church and state seem to have been put to rest. And interestingly, to sort of follow this conversation a little bit further, John T. McGreevy, who's a professor of history at the University of Notre Dame, recently published a book on sort of Catholicism, a global history from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. And McGreevy makes a note about just how remarkable this transformation was over the course of the 20th century. Not just sort of how the Catholic Church sort of rethought its teachings on the separation of church and state and personal religious liberty, but also issues about democracy. McGreevy notes that, quote, authority and justice became the Catholic keywords of the 19th century, definitely not representation or voice. Kind of ideas of democracy were seen as suspect or antithetical to Catholicism, which emphasized proper hierarchy and order. Kind of the Catholic Church since the days of the French Revolution had been condemning the spirit of liberty and excess democracy. But in the 20th century, the Catholic Church wound up becoming one of the great defenders and promoters of democracy. We see this in sort of not just the United States, but global movements for freedom. We can see this in sort of the Solidarity movement in Poland. We see sort of Catholic voices in support of the overthrow of the Marcos regime in the Philippines. We see Christian socialist movements and sort of Christian democratic parties popping up throughout Europe and Latin America over the course of the 20th century. So Catholics sort of mobilized this kind of intellectual inheritance in support of democracy in a way that would have been shocking to those in the 19th century. So as McGreevy observes, in the 1950s, intellectuals had questioned the capacity of Catholics to sustain democracies. But by the 1980s, scholars marveled at Catholicism's role in fostering them. And if you're interested in that book, you can sort of find McGreevy talking about it in various lectures that are recorded on YouTube. I should also note that kind of McGreevy has been sort of part of a generation of Catholic scholars who, in the past generation or so, have been pushing sort of American Catholic scholars to globalize our narratives. that a lot of the conversation within American Catholic history has been focused on American uniqueness and the sort of the distinctiveness of the American Catholic experience. It's kind of the Catholic version of an American historical narrative of American exceptionalism. And so his book on sort of Catholicism, global history is sort of the fruits of maybe sort of a 20-year effort on the part of scholars to reintroduce sort of global narratives and broaden the framework for understanding Catholic history. That not everything that happens in the Church in the United States is unique to the American situation. And the Vatican is not always responding just to us Americans, as much as we may think that is the case, but is really thinking about the global situation. It's a very much not just, he writes it in one point, it's not just about how decisions will play in Peoria, but also how it will play out in places like Pretoria in South Africa. One last note on American Catholic history before we switch gears a little bit. No sort of series on American Catholic history would be complete without a discussion of Dorothy Day. And here, I think these debates over Americanism, it's not just about formal political principles like the separation of church and state, but it's also a question of whether Catholics have become too American in their outlook. Have they come to accept uncritically American values of individualism, capitalism, and rights? Has American patriotism and loyalty to the American way of life overshadowed their Catholic convictions? Have we substituted American values for Catholic values? As Catholics have entered the mainstream and seek social acceptance, have Catholics lost their critical distance and their critical edge? And here's where somebody like Dorothy Day stands out. I think this is one of the reasons that there's so much fascination around Dorothy Day. She stands out as a uniquely American figure, one who resisted the allure of American values. As a convert to Catholicism, she's best remembered as co-founder of the Catholic worker movement, but her social witness extends far beyond that. And here we see sort of Dorothy really sort of wrestling with kind of her Catholic convictions and her American values, and often reminding American Catholics of what it means to be Catholic. So when other leading Catholics supported the New Deal in the 1930s and the growing role of the state in social welfare, Dorothy Day reminded Catholics of their social obligations to one another. At a time when many Catholics enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and aspired to middle-class comfort, Dorothy Day embraced voluntary poverty. When American Catholics rallied around the flag and defended American military action, whether in World War II or Vietnam, she insisted on pacifism. As other American Catholics absorbed American understandings of race and white privilege, she preached racial equality and made a committed stand in support of civil rights. At a time when many American Catholics were becoming more capitalist in their outlook, she continued to uphold the dignity of labor, including marching in support of migrant farm workers. At a time when Americans embraced individualism, she wrote of the need for community. As she noted in her autobiography, quote, "We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes from community." You know, she's not directly speaking about American individualism, but that's very much, I think that's part of the reaction that she's having there. Day was a religious radical. She found the root of Christianity in the message and example of Christ. And when she describes herself as a religious radical, she's thinking about the Latin term for root, which is sort of the Latin word for radical is root. And so she's looking at the root of the Catholic message. She took inspiration from the corporal and spiritual works of mercy and the gospel message, especially the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Day is an interesting counterpoint to other Catholics who had become more comfortable with the American way of life. Day was fully American, but also uncompromisingly Catholic. And so her witness prompts a little bit of soul searching on the part of American Catholics. In the final section of tonight's talk, I want us to maybe think a little bit about the more recent history of polarization within the Catholic Church. This is something that I'm sure is weighing on many of us. It's certainly something that many church observers have called attention to in recent years, and it's in some ways sort of a deep and intractable problem. But maybe one way of addressing it in today's church is also understanding a little bit of the history behind this recent polarization. So this is going to be sort of perhaps a short and abridged history of a long and complicated story. But I should start off by saying that this is not something that is unique to Catholics. And excuse me just one second. Back in 1988, sociologist Robert Wuthnow of Princeton University published a book entitled The Restructuring of American Religion. And this book led to what we describe as the Wuthnow thesis. Looking at the years between 1950 and 1980, he traced a religious realignment marked by the decline of denominationalism and the rise of what he calls special purpose groups. In other words, formal theology came to matter less in terms of one's religious identity than politics, social issues, and other kind of culture war issues, if you will. Liberals joined liberals, conservatives joined conservatives. A liberal Baptist by the 1980s had more in common with a liberal Presbyterian or a liberal Catholic than with a conservative member of his or her own denomination. These findings would hardly shock us today, but it sort of shows how sort of people of faith were sorting themselves along political and social lines. And we can see this play out in how we might think about ecumenism. Back in the 1950s, when people talked about ecumenism, it was often about bridging the divides between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews to sort of come together, to bring those groups together as part of one Judeo-Christian America. But that idea of kind of Protestant Catholic Jew said that the main dividers were those theological lines. We needed to overcome that. But now, when we think about kind of bridging divides within religious community, it's often kind of bridging divides between the right and the left, between liberals and conservatives. That's where kind of the new ecumenism needs to take place. And it's really striking. So kind of Wuthnow tends to focus a little bit more on the Protestant experience, but this is certainly not something that's unique to them. We see it arising in kind of Catholic circles. Today, it's the phenomenon of church shopping, something that would have been unheard of in the pre-Vatican II period when parish boundaries were often vigorously enforced. Catholics didn't get to pick and choose their parish or their pastor or the messaging that they were receiving. They were supposed to go to their local church. Vatican II opens the door for a little bit more movement in and out. We also see kind of by the 1980s, kind of as a reflection of this Wuthnow thesis, the way that sort of Catholics will ascribe labels to their version of Catholicism, that you now have sort of liberal Catholics or conservative Catholics, Orthodox, traditionalist, progressive, kind of where previously the labels that would have been ascribed to Catholics would have been Irish or German or Polish or Italian, kind of that ethnic identity sometimes masked the political divides that would have been present within Catholicism. But as some of those ethnic markers of Catholicism fade away over the course of the post-World War II, post-Vatican II period, what replaces that? What new markers of identity replace those older ethnic labels? And often it's these political terms that we now sort of see all over the place. Part of this too is sort of the rise of sort of polarization is perhaps reflective of perhaps a rightward drift within American Catholicism, but it's not just sort of that American Catholics became more conservative, but that there was sort of a fracturing of an older coalition. By the 1930s, we had a strong sort of Catholic political bloc that was sort of held together by kind of the New Deal and New Deal priorities. The New Deal was very much sort of driven by kind of a Catholic working class, a Catholic urban political machine. And so that helped keep Catholics together. But by the 1960s, 1970s, we see the fracturing of that old political coalition in the wake of the turmoil of the 1960s. Political activists certainly worked to exploit some of these sort of growing divisions within the Catholic community. Figures like Paul Weyrich, he's sort of a lesser known figure today, but he was one of the primary architects of the new right that eventually becomes part of the Christian coalition. Weyrich drew very heavily on Catholic thought in order to make the kind of conservative political message resonate with Catholics. Curiously, as a young man, he rejected the ecumenical reforms of the Second Vatican Council. And during his career as a political operative, he worked to bring together Catholics and Protestants into a new political coalition. And he was one of many sort of political operatives at the time who realized that conservatives could bring Catholics into the Republican Party over values issues. And this was a way of bringing together kind of sort of religious voters across the denominational spectrum. So for Weyrich, he sort of sees pro-life issues as one way of drawing Catholics over to a kind of a coalition with evangelicals. And that was kind of remarkable at the time because kind of evangelicals up until the 1970s really did not see abortion as an issue of concern. They left abortion, they considered abortion to be a Catholic issue. But sort of members of this sort of growing religious right saw it as a way of bringing those parties together. We also see it with sort of other family values issues. Somebody like Phyllis Schlafly during the 1970s leading the anti-ERA movement, the anti-Equal Rights Amendment movement, that really sort of brought many sort of conservative Catholic women into kind of a new political fold in defense of family values and kind of a reaction to sort of 1960s liberalism and kind of women's liberation. During the 1970s, we also see kind of Republican and conservative forces emphasizing issues of law and order. It was sometimes a bit of a dog whistle in response to the civil rights movement. That resonated with sort of white democratic voters in the American South. But that emphasis on law and order also had particular resonance for Catholics in the North, who were responding to what they saw as kind of excessive American sort of the excesses of the 1960s, youth culture, and other sort of social forces, kind of the culture of dissent and radicalism that was growing in the 1960s. And so for Catholic voters, even in the North, they may not be directly influenced by the civil rights movement, but they rejected things like forced busing within public schools in places like Detroit and Boston, heavily Catholic cities. So suddenly that sort of GOP message of law and order and local control had a sort of a great deal of resonance with Catholics. And so we see kind of American Catholic voters moving from kind of strong alliance with the Democratic Party, moving more towards the Republican and becoming kind of evenly split 50-50. So by the 1980s, we have the phenomenon of Reagan Democrats, which included a large number of Catholics. And the graph at the bottom sort of shows where we are today, that kind of it starts off in the mid-1960s, but then by 1980, we start to see kind of almost close to a 50-50 divide, which is present now. And so Catholics in some way become politically homeless. Neither political party fully represents the Catholic position in its entirety. So Catholics then have to pick and choose which party best aligns with their values. And the last point there, by the 1980s, there was also sort of a growing sort of effort among Catholic intellectuals to sort of promote these more conservative ideas. And here we have figures like John Richard Newhouse, the founding editor of First Things. Writing in 1987, Richard Newhouse argued that liberals had taken control of national and diocesan offices, and that it was often a liberal minority that was sort of dominating. Today, we might say that the opposite has happened, that sort of a small group of conservative Catholics who use their money and their intellectual influence in order to steer political affairs. Some of these debates over kind of the direction of US Catholicism spilled out in sort of formal church affairs. And here we can look at the history of the bishop's pastoral letters during the 1980s. After Vatican II, the council sort of called upon local conferences of bishops to take a more active role and to speak out on issues of importance. And so the US bishops in the United States took up that challenge with two pastoral letters. The first on issues of war, with the sort of release of The Challenge of Peace in 1983, and then on issues of the economy, writing in sort of Economic Justice for All in 1986. These pastoral letters took a great deal of study and drafting and revision. They took sort of the better part of 5-6 years in order to draft, and then they were, before they were promulgated by the bishops. In the Challenge of Peace, the bishops were responding to kind of the late Cold War nuclear arm race and a policy of nuclear deterrence that was growing. They went back and looked at those issues through the lens of just war theory and sort of spoke out against the use of nuclear deterrence. In Economic Justice for All, they drew on Catholic social teachings to address the economy. And kind of the 1970s and the 1980s were a difficult economic period. The 1970s were a period of stagflation, sort of a great deal of kind of economic hardship as Americans saw the decline of kind of manufacturing and industry and the shift towards a new service economy. And by the 1980s, an emphasis on sort of free market economics and deregulation. And so in Economic Justice for All, the bishops are calling attention to the need to strengthen the social safety net, but also reminding American Catholics and Americans that sort of the economic system must exercise a preferential option for the poor, and that the economy has a human face. Both of these letters, even though approved by the bishops, were criticized by conservative Catholic voices. Figures like Michael Novak spoke out against the Challenge of Peace, saying that it sort of needed to take greater account for the need for prudence. Economic Justice for All was criticized by sort of conservative economic voices, including Catholics, who said that the bishops failed to account for the role of capitalism in fostering economic growth, and that capitalism itself can help sort of address the needs of poverty. This is the 1980s. Think of things like trickle-down economics. But here it was kind of remarkable that kind of the Catholic bishops faced criticism from kind of a kind of newly assertive Catholic right. Earlier, ideas of dissent often tended to be attributed to the liberal side of things. So people would look back at sort of the radicalism of the 1960s, or things like kind of a Catholic liberal dissent against that sort of things like Humanae Vitae, the Catholic Church's Pope Paul VI encyclical on human life that reaffirmed the Catholic Church's absolute ban on artificial contraception. So in the 1960s, we see a great deal of liberal dissent. And now in the 1980s, we see kind of conservative dissent. In the wake of all of that, the polarization within the Catholic Church did not go unnoticed by Catholic leaders. While many on both sides simply bickered that members of the other camp were wrong, there were efforts to attempt to bridge the divide. The most prominent was the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, which stands out in part because it proved to be controversial. The Common Ground Initiative was proposed and spearheaded by Cardinal Joseph Bernardin of Chicago, who convened a series of meetings between 1993 and 1996 among bishops, theologians, academics, and other leading voices within the Catholic community. He intentionally included individuals from across the ideological and theological spectrum. Bernardin was a leading figure, a leading force within the US Church. He had been he had chaired the study that led to the challenge of peace. And he was also one who popularized the idea of the seamless garment of Catholic social teaching. He used the phrase in a speech at Fordham University in 1983 as a way of making clear that sort of abortion, war, poverty, and other issues were all fundamentally linked. Others at the time spoke about the need for a consistent ethic of life that avoided this sort of polarization. The Common Ground Initiative was premised on the conviction that polarization was destructive to the church, and that it was also deceptive because it left out the vast middle. Too much the extremes tended to occupy all the oxygen in the room. At the end of the study, Bernardin issued a statement called to be Catholic, which recognized that differences of opinion were inevitable, but also called for dialogue. We should recognize that no single group or viewpoint in the church has a complete monopoly on the truth, he wrote. But within hours of this statement, Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston issued a public criticism, claiming that the fundamental flaw of the document was its, quote, appeal for dialogue as a path to common ground. For Law, truth could not be dialogued away. In the days that follow, Law was joined by the cardinals of Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Detroit in criticizing the Common Ground Initiative. It was the very public nature of the rebuke against a fellow bishop and a fellow cardinal was shocking and did little to bridge the theological and ideological divides. And so it sort of showed the polarization had seeped into the episcopate itself. Bernardin's death from pancreatic cancer the following November halted the Common Ground Initiative's momentum, even though it continues to exist in this day. And so some of this kind of sort of shows how it was very difficult, even at that time, to find common ground. And I'm running low on time here, but there are other factors that also contribute to this polarization besides just the theological debates. Some of it has to do with the decline of an earlier Catholic subculture. Prior to Vatican II, it was very clear what it meant to be Catholic. It meant devotions and novenas and Catholic school uniforms and sort of eating fish on Friday and sort of a rich devotional life and all of those markers of Catholic identity. As some of that fades away, there's a question of what does it mean to be Catholic? So people start looking for other markers of Catholic identity. In some ways, the pro-life movement of the 1980s and 1990s was a way of articulating what it meant to be distinctively Catholic. We also see kind of in the midst of that kind of a rise of Catholic traditionalism, kind of the return of the traditional Latin Mass and things like that. Part of it is a uniquely Catholic response to maybe some of the kind of liturgical excesses and liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council, but also kind of return to Catholic traditionalism is something that sociologists of religion see in other denominations as well, kind of a return to sort of orthodoxy within American Judaism. And here often the idea is that kind of there's the sort of religion of grandparents that maybe parents reject and then grandchildren return back to as they're looking for family history and a sense of connection to the past. So we see that perhaps in kind of Catholic traditionalism. The immediate Vatican II generation rejected some of those older notions, and then the generation that grows up after the post-Vatican II generation looks for a return and finds meaning in some of the devotional practices, Eucharistic adoration, sort of and other sort of hallmarks of Catholic identity that maybe kind of the immediate Vatican II generation shifted away from. We also see polarization being sort of exacerbated by a polarized media landscape. And here we can just point to the NCRs, the difference between the National Catholic Register and the National Catholic Reporter, that if you look at their headlines on any given day, they're reporting church news very differently. And part of me very much yearns for the day of diocesan newspapers. With cost cutting, many dioceses have sort of shifted away from sponsoring their own newspapers and media outlets. But there was something about those kind of Catholic, the Catholic press of the mid-20th century, that those diocesan newspapers saw it as their mission to represent the diocese as a whole, kind of the mainstream of Catholic opinion, and to sort of also guard against the excesses of different camps. Today, kind of the media landscape in some ways is a Wild West. And we see that especially on the internet with today's Catholic influencers, where anybody can presume to speak for the Catholic Church. It makes some of us perhaps long for the days of formal imprimaturs, where everything had to sort of receive an official seal of approval. That's not the case anymore. So what's the solution? I wish I knew. But I think here maybe we can learn from Pope Francis. And if you've been following the developments of the past 2 years with the workings of the Synod, here's where perhaps Pope Francis is onto something. That in response to polarization, he talks about the need for the medicine of mercy. That's the antidote. That's the medicine we need. To be charitable towards one another, to emphasize sort of God's mercy, rather than perhaps using sort of truth as sort of a cudgel, a weapon against perceived enemies. That's very much the case by those who sort of uphold themselves as sort of having the fullness of the truth as they narrowly define it. The Synod process has also emphasized the need for listening to one another, just to gather together at a table. Listening sessions at parishes were remarkably fruitful and in some ways a really novel experience for many Catholics. At my parish here in New Jersey, we conducted listening sessions, and it was the first time that many within the parish had been invited to share their views on the church and to have that sort of exchange with one another. So I hope that in some ways this synodal process will lead to kind of a change in spirit within the church and make us much more sort of hospitable to one another and to look beyond our divides. Some final lessons for tonight. I think that these Americanist debates reveal something about the tension inherent in American Catholicism. If you take those two words and separate them out, is the American and the Catholic compatible? To what extent? The Americanism debates are also a reminder that we live in a global church. Catholicism is global in nature, so things that take place in the United States are being weighed by the Vatican in light of global realities. And that we American Catholics also have to be more mindful of kind of the needs and conditions faced by our sort of fellow Catholics throughout the world. These Americanist controversies are a reminder that internal disputes are nothing new, but perhaps that polarization has grown more pronounced in recent decades for a number of years. I didn't talk about this, but I think also about how these sort of Catholic culture wars of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s up through today carry a long legacy. They've shaped a generation. This has certainly been part of the reason that some sort of have turned away from the church and turned away from Catholicism, because it's not fruitful to be in those sorts of sort of contested, divided situations, not just within parishes, but also within families. And so here, perhaps we do need synodality, but also I think as a historian that we need stories that help us move beyond polarization. So perhaps telling stories of common ground can be one way of thinking about a way of healing some of these divisions. One last slide that I will leave you with, and sort of the next slide has some recommendations perhaps for some books for those who are interested. But maybe at the very beginning of this series, I should have said something more about what makes me interested in American Catholicism. And tonight we're talking about divisions, but I think one of the things that has made me sort of interested in American Catholicism and that makes Catholicism utterly fascinating is that it embodies a range of dualisms. And here I want to say dualisms, not divides. But kind of Catholicism has sort of these creative tensions within itself. So we see kind of this sort of emphasis on Catholic unity, but also recognition of Catholic diversity. Catholicism is one of the most internally diverse religious communities in the United States and globally. No other faith or denomination brings together so many people across so many different divides, whether it's ethnic, racial, linguistic, socioeconomic, or demographic. Catholicism also embodies a dualism between the ancient and the modern, between tradition and reform. It holds those in creative tension. The Catholic Church is ever ancient, ever new. I like the fact that Catholicism sort of represents both an intellectual tradition, but also respects the richness of culture. Catholicism is a faith shaped by rich schools of thought and multiple schools of thought, but also robust forms of cultural expression. It's about formal ideas, but also how belief is transmitted through art, literature, architecture, and material objects. Catholicism, as I was just saying a couple minutes ago, is global, but also local. I'm impressed by how Catholicism operates at various scales. It's a global faith, but profoundly local. Kind of Catholics are often accused of kind of parochialism. Sort of growing up, I can sort of think of sort of my grandparents whose the only parish they knew was the parish they went to. They never stepped foot in another parish. So they were completely sort of viewing the Catholic lens through their own local experience, but also were aware of global transformations, following news from the Vatican, following news from kind of the church in Poland. So they operated at those different scales. And then finally, kind of this sort of the sort of dualism between kind of Catholic hierarchy, but also popular faith. The Catholic Church is both top-down with an emphasis on proper authority, but also guided by popular movements and the sense of the faithful. So kind of all of that is part of this American Catholic story and global Catholic story. And that's very much what kind of Catholic historians have to sort of navigate and negotiate. As a recap, kind of these were the 5 sessions that we went through over the course of these past few weeks, from the American foundations and the immigrant church on through the brick and mortar Catholicism, mid-century modern, and then Americanism revisited. And if you're interested in sort of learning more about American Catholicism, these are just a couple of the broad surveys that I might recommend. The 2 most recent kind of textbook surveys of American Catholicism are Leslie Tentler's American Catholics, A History, and James M. O'Toole's The Faithful, A History of Catholics in America, that talks about the lay experience. And then for the sake of shameless self-promotion, there's also the Cambridge Companion to American Catholicism that I co-edited with Margaret McGuinness, that has 19 chapters written by excellent scholars that provide very nice, crisp, accessible introductions on topics like not just sort of Catholic history, but Catholic education, women religious, Catholic liturgy and worship, the Catholic intellectual tradition, Black Catholics, Latinx Catholics, and the like. So those are some great resources that might be of interest to some people. So with that, I am happy to sort of stop sharing my screen. and open it up to questions, conversations, not just about tonight, but about the series as a whole, or just Catholic history in general.
I think Matthew was going to bring everybody in, so if they had questions. Steve Henry has his hand raised to want to ask a question. Steve? Matthew, you can bring everybody in, all right?
Okay, they are.
Steve? Steve, you have to unmute. You had your hand up, but we need you to unmute.
Thank you.
Great, we can hear you.
I really enjoyed your presentation, Thomas. A couple things. I'm kind of a historian. I just have 3 degrees in theology, but anyways, a couple things in the American scene and the Canadian scene, I think are running parallel. First of all, Humanae Vitae. I think that was the telling point for lay Catholics to, we've had enough. I listened while I was a seminarian to Bernard Herring, Karl Rahner, all those people that I greatly respected, but they were clergy. And when I look at Humanae Vitae, and people rejected that outright. It was around 65 or 75%, according to Greeley. And I think that was the defining moment when there is a wide division between the clergy and the laity. Secondly, I would say the sexual abuse. I'm from Canada. I was in the seminary with 2 fellow seminarians who were notorious pedophiles. I attended a 3-month trial of a pedophile priest at the seminary. And I learned so much from that. And the anger that was there was unbelievable. And I think those are 2 critical moments for the Catholics. The clergy, clericalism has to be eliminated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't disagree at all that those are pivotal sort of moments in the life of the Catholic Church. You know, for the sex abuse crisis, I did not include it as part of the talk simply because I'm sure that most listeners are aware of sort of the sex abuse crisis, and we're still learning more and more about how deeply that has sort of scarred the church. But here, kind of, I think it's not just sort of, if tonight we're thinking about divisions within the church, there it's also about a distrust of the institution. With Humanae Vitae, again, I completely agree as sort of seeing that as a pivotal moment in kind of American Catholicism, partly because it was so personal for so many Catholics. They themselves had to decide whether or not to use contraception, you know, and it wasn't sort of Catholics choosing not to have children. It was often sort of the baby boom generation where they'd already had 5, 6, 8 children and were sort of wondering, you know, can they support more? And so with the absolute ban on artificial contraception, it forced sort of many lay Catholics to simply sort of take those matters into their own hands, you know, and into their own hearts. So they had to sort of weigh those decisions. So yeah, thank you for that comment. I think you're sort of pinpointing sort of other moments of remarkable, of important sort of transformation within the U.S. Catholic Church.
Thank you.
Anyone else out there have a question or comment?
Well, I have a comment. Great class, Thomas. I really learned a lot. And thank you, sister, for your group for putting this on. It's so important. This morning, I got a Fresh Air update, a podcast from Fresh Air, and they were interviewing a author who came out with a new book last week called Jesus Wept, and it's on the history of the last 7 popes. Now, the author, and I think his name was Sheehan, I may be wrong about that, but not a Catholic, a Protestant, but not even a believer, more of an agnostic. So he puts, I mean, that's up front, right? But his whole perspective on the church is that the whole church globally, and he brings up these two issues, right? Humanae Vitae and the sex abuse scandal. And so one of the things that I want to know is, from a global perspective, and we're talking about globalism early on, was the sex abuse scandal an American? I mean, certainly I can't imagine that it's just an American issue, but how global was that problem? And yes, the church should have done something a lot quicker about it. I agree with the preview with Father Henry there. That's true, right? But there were other issues too that the C has to deal with. So, is that a fair criticism? Because it seems like outside criticism is laser focused on those issues.
Yeah, I mean, sort of, I'm no expert on sort of the global history of the sex abuse crisis, but certainly, you know, it is not limited to the United States. Sort of places like Ireland have had sex abuse crisis. The church in Germany has had sort of to deal with the fallout of their own sex abuse crisis. You know, but kind of part of the challenge when it first erupted in the United States, you know, in the wake of the Boston Globe report, you know, so many people in the United States wanted the Vatican to act. They sort of wanted kind of an American style immediate response, you know, and that included things like being on top of the PR debate. You know, sort of one thing's like, you know, the Catholic Church fell flat in the United States because they didn't know how to respond. You know, especially sort of bishops are like, well, we're waiting to hear from Rome. Well, that doesn't work in kind of a media landscape. And of course, Rome can't act just for the United States because policies over how do you deal with clergy is a matter of sort of canon law, universal policies, global situations, all of that sort of stuff. So there are kind of those tensions built into kind of the sort of the global Catholic response to Vatican II. And kind of sometimes Americans forgot that Rome is thinking in a global framework where we were not. That's not to excuse any of their actions, but that helps explain some of the sort of the way the response played out. Also think sort of some of it too was that sometimes the Vatican officials did not understand the severity of the US situation. They were getting bad news from the people on the ground here who were trying to sort of cover things up. And I even sort of somebody like John Paul II, kind of as some of these abuse cases pop up elsewhere, you know, somebody like John Paul II who sort of, I think, was mindful of sort of criticism against the clergy, and he doubted some of the reports, you know, and that's perhaps a reflection of growing up in communist era Poland, where kind of the communist government often sort of looked for opportunities to discredit clergy, discredit the church. So how much of these reports were accurate and how much of what was sort of kind of sort of the enemies of the church conspiring against it. So sometimes, you know, kind of the way an individual reads those events worsened the response. But yeah, kind of the sex abuse crisis, sort of that book by John McGreevy, the sort of global sort of a history of global Catholicism from the French Religion book, has sort of a chapter on the sex abuse crisis, simply because it's an unavoidable reality of global Catholicism.
Tom, there's so many things that you said tonight that I'm connecting to other things, but we had a webinar in the fall on climate, the new Catholic imperative, and one of the first speaker talked about, and he hesitated to say this, but he went on to say that how Catholics feel about climate is very much divided on Republican and Democratic lines. So I was thinking about that while you were talking about how it's become political. It's not just ethnic anymore, Italians and Irish or Polish and Irish, but it's very much political. And one of the other things he brought out was that younger people feel a certain disenfranchisement with the church because they tend to be less inclined towards radical individualism, radical capitalism, radical individual rights, which is, those are three words that you mentioned. Have we become too American with individualism, capitalism, rights, and have we substituted American values for Catholic values? And I wonder if sometimes one of the reasons that we have a kind of romanticism in the post-Vatican II generation is because it just steps away from American values. And I wonder if young people are turned off by the church. We talk about, well, the church doesn't like gay people, or they're not kind to, married and divorced. And, Jean brought up the pedophile scandal. But I wonder if it's much deeper turnoff to the embrace or the almost Catholic Church being in bed with these radical American values, which younger people today are looking at and saying, they're not good for me and they're not good for the world. So I don't know what you think about that. You're still teaching in college. I've been out
There
of
might, I think for some college students, there's sort of, there might be some appeal to kind of a Catholic radicalism along the Dorothy Day lines, sort of that challenges conventions, that challenges norms and complacency. Kind of students who do hear about her sort of are amazed by her story. But that's kind of a particular, I think, sort of still a subset of Catholics. But, kind of maybe part of it too is that kind of it's this kind of a way that it's a search for authenticity. And sometimes that's the problem. It's sort of, they look at sort of things like internal hypocrisy, sort of the Catholic Church not being welcome to different groups. So how do you sort of capture perhaps that spirit of authenticity that might meet this current generation? But sort of, I was writing down some notes on your point about ecology, and I sort of lost track a little bit of the question there.
Okay.
But I also think that when I think about some of that, sort of Pope Francis's Laudato Si is really interesting, because I think that encyclical reflects something about kind of the global and the local nature and how Pope Francis has changed things a little bit. The scholar in me, in looking at Laudato Si, sort of looks at the footnotes. And when you look at that document, the people that he's citing isn't just sort of previous popes, but he's citing sort of the Bishops' Conference in South America, the Bishops' Conference in New Zealand, the Bishops' Conference in India, So Pope Francis, in a way, through that document, is modeling the listening church. He hears all of these voices from kind of the Catholic community throughout the world, and he sees it as his job to sort of vacuum them up and sort of package them together to speak then for the church. So he's simply becoming sort of the voice for all of those different Catholic communities. That's a different model of like papal leadership than kind of like a 19th century monarchical papacy, where the Pope decides and every single bishop and parish priest carries out the marching orders of the Pope. So kind of that older sort of centralized model of sort of papal authority. Here, Pope Francis wants to say, we listen first and then we speak. So kind of really interesting to sort of see those types of sort of transformations and global realities at work.
Somebody wanted to know if you could, how they could get the books that were on your last slide. So Matthew, when you put up this, video from tonight, will those books be included in it?
Yes, it will be on the slides, and I can include it in the course, in the YouTube video description.
All right. And so whoever wrote Spirit Alive attendee, your name is not listed. I think that I'm hoping that that's an answer that you're satisfied with, that if you wait for Matthew to post the video, which probably go up in the next 48 to 72 hours, you'll be able to go to that final, can move through the video and then get to that final page or two where Tom put up his last slide on the books. So hopefully that would be okay. Somebody else is writing in. Yes, thank you. Okay, Marina, well, wonderful. So yeah, just go to the videos. That's why we keep them, so that if there's anything that you really want to hear, again, you have that opportunity. So it's 8:18. I want to, first of all, thank Tom. Tom and I were colleagues for a while, and it's nice to have spent 5 consecutive weeks with him again, learning from him, being instructed by him. And as I said, after our first presentation, I left it a little bit less ignorant than when I came in. And after 5 weeks, still a lot of lacunae, but I honestly do feel a lot less ignorant than I did when we began this course. So I thank you, Tom. You've been patient, wonderful, answering questions, providing an enormous breadth of material. Just today, we were talking about the drive-in church that you mentioned last week, and talking and laughing about that. So I thank you. For those of you attending, next week we don't have any classes, but on March 11th, we begin a new 5-week course that will carry through most of Lent on making sense of the atonement in light of the new cosmology. So that should be very interesting, by Sister Lori Brink from Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She'll be our guest. So I thank all of you. And tonight, in a special way, let's join with the Universal Church, all of the people standing pilgrim outside the Holy Father's Hospital, all the people gathered in St. Peter's Square, to pray to all the saints, and especially to the Creator God, to restore Francis to good health and allow him to continue to be the shepherd that the church needs today, bringing courage and wisdom to a world so in need of what Francis has to say. So thank you all. Good night. Amen. Hope to see you all again. Thank you. Bye.